When one hears the word gladiators, the imagination immediately conjures scenes of fierce battles, the deafening roar of a jubilant crowd, and the imperious gesture of an emperor, thumb pointed downwards. However, to what extent do these formed images correspond to historical truth? Gladiatorial combat, contrary to popular belief, was not merely brutal fighting, but an entire industry, thriving thanks to enormous financial turnover, universal recognition, and political influence. It is noteworthy that not only enslaved people joined the ranks of gladiators, but also volunteers, consciously choosing this path and entering gladiator schools, known as ludi, of their own free will. And even the figure of Spartacus, often portrayed as a valiant freedom fighter, was perhaps a far more complex and ambiguous personality, whose true motives still remain a mystery to historians. In this regard, there arises a need to understand the interweaving of truth and fiction surrounding gladiatorial fights, and to understand why Roman society itself felt such a deep fear of these warriors. And of course, special attention will be paid to the most exciting episode in the history of gladiatorial combat, the uprising led by Spartacus. Speaking of gladiators, most people immediately imagine the image of prisoners and slaves who were forcibly sent to the arena to entertain the public at the cost of their lives. Undoubtedly, a significant portion of gladiators did indeed come from prisoners of war and criminals sentenced to gladiatorial games as punishment. Nevertheless, surprisingly, a tangible proportion of people voluntarily chose the path of a gladiator. This decision may seem illogical and even insane, given that gladiatorial combat practically guaranteed a painful death. However, if you carefully consider all the circumstances, such a choice becomes more understandable and rational. First, gladiators, like modern athletes and actors, were true stars of their time. Their fame and popularity could surpass the fame of even the most influential senators. They received impressive monetary rewards, even in the event of defeat in the arena. Many Romans, driven by a thirst for fame and wealth, were willing to risk their lives for such an opportunity. Second, for a certain category of people, the gladiatorial arena became the only real chance to escape the shackles of poverty and disenfranchisement. A person could sell themselves into gladiatorship, concluding a special contract known as an auctoratus. This process was very similar to modern professional sports. The person was trained, provided with everything necessary, and given a chance to prove themselves and earn decent money. Third, gladiators played not only the role of fighters, but were also an important political tool. Influential and wealthy Romans used them as a kind of private army, and in some cases even sent them to their political opponents so that they would accidentally die in the arena. Thus, gladiatorial combat was, first of all, a business, distinguished by particular cruelty. If a person turned out to be weak and incapable of survival, they became only expendable material. If they showed strength and skill, those who possessed power and influence began to use them for their own benefit. It is in this context that the question of Spartacus's personality arises. His name is one of the most enigmatic and controversial in the entire history of humankind. Numerous books have been written about him. Films and series have been made, glorifying his exploits. For some, he is a hero, a symbol of the struggle for freedom. For others, he is merely a lucky rebel who managed to take advantage of the situation. But who was he really? Unfortunately, the historical sources that tell about Spartacus are extremely contradictory and do not give a definite answer to this question. Some claim that he was a Thracian, captured by the Romans and enslaved. Others, on the contrary, suggest that he himself served in the Roman army, but deserted and was sentenced to gladiatorial games as punishment for his betrayal. It is important to understand that the image of Spartacus was formed after his death, under the influence of various political and ideological currents. Roman historians, describing him, recognized him as a formidable opponent, but at the same time did not feel any admiration for him. Medieval authors hardly mentioned him in their writings, and only in the 19th and 20th centuries did he suddenly turn into a symbol of revolution and the struggle against social injustice. It remains unclear whether Spartacus really sought to free all slaves from slavery. Historians are still arguing about what goal he pursued. Did he dream of creating a new state? Did he want to leave Italy? Or did he simply crave revenge on the Romans for all the suffering they had caused? Roman citizens were crazy about gladiatorial combat. Crowds of people filled huge amphitheaters, gamblers placed large bets on the outcome of the fights, and street vendors briskly sold clay figurines depicting the most popular gladiators. Gladiators became real idols. They were praised and worshipped. Women dreamed of them, and men simultaneously admired their strength and despised them for their low origin. However, behind this universal love and adoration lay a deep fear that permeated Roman society to its very foundations. Gladiators posed a serious danger. They were not just strong and well-trained fighters, they were real killers, perfectly mastering the art of close combat. Unlike ordinary legionaries who fought in formation, acting on clear commands, gladiators were used to killing alone, relying solely on their skills, reaction speed, and ability to survive in the most extreme conditions. They knew perfectly well how to pierce armor in such a way that the blow was fatal, how to break bones, how to use any features of the terrain and weather conditions to their advantage. The Roman elite were well aware of the potential threat posed by these people, trained to kill and not afraid of death. That is why gladiatorial schools were guarded no worse than strict prisons. The authorities forbade recruiting too many fighters in one place, fearing possible conspiracies and revolts. When mass gladiatorial games were held in the city, all the gladiators were locked up in barracks and security was increased. They were strictly forbidden to carry weapons outside the arena, and any suspicion of preparing for a rebellion was punished with immediate and cruel reprisal. And this fear, as history shows, was quite justified. History remembers many cases when gladiators revolted, killed their owners, and escaped from gladiator schools. Often such attempts were suppressed with brutal speed. The fugitives were caught and crucified along the roads, turning their bodies into a clear warning to everyone else. But one day, an event occurred that horrified the Roman nobility, a revolt that reached incredible proportions and shook all of Italy to its foundations. Gladiators were always on the shaky border between recognition and contempt. They could reach incredible heights of fame and popularity, but at the same time remained outcasts, rejected by society. Being slaves by their status, they posed a deadly danger to those who owned them, and at some point, the fear that the Romans so carefully hid in their souls was embodied in a terrifying reality. A gladiator is a kind of death sentence, meaning a life spent in chains, exhausting daily training, and inevitable death in the arena, fighting for the entertainment of the public. This is how this cruel world appears in films and books. However, it should be noted that not all gladiators were doomed from birth and only dreamed of escaping from the arena and gaining long-awaited freedom. The most numerous group of gladiators consisted of prisoners of war captured in the numerous wars that Rome waged. The Roman Empire was constantly expanding its borders, waging endless wars with barbarian tribes, Greeks, Thracians, Gauls, and other peoples. Captured enemies were not always killed immediately. Often they were given a choice, to accept immediate death or to try to find fortune in the gladiatorial arena. Many, driven by the instinct of self-preservation and the hope of survival, chose the second option. Next on this sad list were criminals who had committed serious crimes. If a person committed murder, organized a rebellion, or committed another serious crime, the court could sentence them to gladiatorial games. However, their fate was even more tragic than that of prisoners of war. They were not subjected to any preliminary preparation or training, but were simply thrown into the arena, doomed to certain death in battle, either against a professional gladiator or against ferocious wild beasts. But there were also those who became gladiators of their own free will, voluntarily. Free Roman citizens, for various reasons, sold themselves into gladiatorship in pursuit of money and fame. This was voluntary slavery, but it had a certain meaning. Someone was trying to get rid of debts in this way. Someone dreamed of universal recognition and wealth. Some sincerely believed that they could defeat the system, accumulate enough funds, and buy their freedom. Volunteers were not considered slaves in the full sense of the word, but they still lost all civil rights and were obliged to wear a special distinctive collar, which served as a constant reminder of their belonging to the world of gladiators. However, no matter what path led a person to a gladiator school, the end for most turned out to be the same: the arena. Here it no longer mattered who they once were, a soldier, a peasant, or a Roman citizen. Here they were just a gladiator, a living toy in the hands of a ruthless fate. And the Romans adored gladiatorial spectacles. They bet on the winners, argued fiercely about the outcome of the fights, and scratched the names of their favorite fighters on the walls of houses and public buildings. The greatest gladiators were celebrated and praised like sports champions are today, their victories hotly debated in bathhouses and taverns. But it was a strange, contradictory admiration. Gladiators were both idols and outcasts, public favorites and societal rejects. The crowds enthusiastically chanted their names, but if one of them dared to enter the home of a respectable Roman citizen, he would be promptly ejected without ceremony. Nevertheless, despite this, many gladiators became true stars of their time. There were fighters known by name in every corner of the Roman Empire. They were recognized on the streets. Their images appeared on clay lamps and even on children's toys. Moreover, they aroused burning passion and desire. Wealthy Roman women, disregarding propriety, sought secret meetings with gladiators, bribing guards to sneak to them at night. There was a belief that a gladiator's blood was a source of inexhaustible vitality. Women mixed it with cosmetics, sincerely believing it could bestow beauty and eternal youth. But no matter how famous and popular they were, Roman society never fully accepted gladiators into its fold. A gladiator could not become a senator or hold high public office. He could not marry a woman from a respectable and noble family. He could become wealthy, but he could never become an equal to members of the Roman elite. Besides entertaining the public, gladiatorial combats were a powerful tool of governance. Politicians staged lavish gladiatorial games to win popular favor and solidify their positions. The more grandiose and spectacular the show, the more votes the politician received in elections. A candidate who generously funded gladiatorial combats could count on the support of the crowd, hungry for bread and circuses. Emperors used gladiatorial games to keep the people in check and distract them from pressing issues. When unrest and discontent flared up in the city, the Senate could simply announce major gladiatorial games, and people would instantly forget all their problems, consumed by excitement and anticipation of the thrilling spectacle. But gladiators were not only a means of entertainment and a way to manipulate public opinion. They represented a potential threat to the existing order. Julius Caesar maintained a private gladiatorial school in Capua, huge in scale, with hundreds of trained fighters. His political opponents argued, not without reason, that it was not just a school for gladiators, but a true personal army, ready to carry out any order at any moment. And they were not far from the truth. In the final period of the Roman Republic, gladiators were used not only to entertain the public in arenas, but also to resolve various political issues in the streets of cities. They carried out attacks on undesirable persons, intimidated political opponents, and actively participated in urban clashes and riots. The ruling elite quickly realized that gladiatorial schools could become a powerful weapon in the struggle for power. In this regard, special laws were adopted, strictly prohibiting private individuals from maintaining large detachments of gladiators. Subsequently, the Roman emperors established strict control over all gladiatorial schools, ensuring that no influential senator could use the arena fighters as his personal army. Thus, gladiators became an integral part of the Roman political system. They served to entertain the people, distracting them from pressing problems and crises, and were a secret weapon in the struggle for power, used in the most delicate situations. But most importantly, gladiators were always under the close and vigilant control of the authorities, who carefully monitored their activities and suppressed any attempts at disobedience. Next, we will take a detailed look at the specific types of gladiators that existed in ancient Rome, and why each gladiatorial combat was a real chess game in the arena, where every move could be decisive. The arena was a kind of theater, where each fighter embodied a certain fighting style, and their opponents were selected in such a way that the duel was as spectacular, exciting, and unpredictable as possible. In ancient Rome, there was a clear and strict system for classifying gladiators. Their weaponry, protective gear, and fighting style were carefully thought out to the smallest detail and met specific requirements. One of the most popular and spectacular pairings in the arena were Thracians and Myrmilones. These fights were symbolic, reflecting the centuries-old conflict between the Romans and the Thracians, which was one of the main themes of Rome's military history. Thracians were lightly armed gladiators, whose fighting style closely resembled the tactics of real Thracian warriors, whom the Romans had faced in numerous battles. The main weapon of the Thracian was a curved short sword, known as a sica. This distinctive blade was specifically designed to bypass the opponent's shields and deliver insidious blows to the most vulnerable areas, especially the legs and shoulders. The Thracian's shield was small, round, but strong enough, allowing him to move quickly around the arena, deftly dodge the opponent's attacks, and effectively parry blows. Body protection was kept to a minimum: a short greave on one leg, a helmet with a high crest and curved visor, giving him a recognizable and memorable appearance. Thracians relied on high mobility and a waiting game. Their main task was to force the opponent to make a mistake, miss, and deliver a swift, unexpected blow. However, this fighting style also had significant drawbacks. If a Thracian missed a strong blow, he had virtually no chance of standing and avoiding serious injury due to his weak protection. Most often, Thracians fought against Myrmilones, who were their complete opposites in fighting style. In the arena, the Myrmilo appeared as a heavy, slowly advancing wall encased in armor. His task was not to jump and deftly maneuver around the opponent or deliver fast, lightning-fast strikes, but to methodically corner the opponent and use any convenient opportunity for a powerful and devastating attack. Unlike light and mobile gladiators such as Thracians, the Myrmilo relied on reliable protection and endurance. He was armed with a huge rectangular shield that covered almost the entire body, and a heavy helmet with a crest that completely covered the face. He wore an arm guard on one arm, but unlike the Thracians, he had no greaves, and his legs remained relatively vulnerable. The Myrmilo's main weapon was the gladius, a short, straight sword designed for thrusting attacks. It could not be used for sweeping, slashing blows, but it was ideal for quick and precise thrusting attacks. This same sword was used by Roman legionaries in combat, and many Myrmilones were former soldiers who had become gladiators for committing crimes, accumulating debts, or due to military defeat. The Myrmilo's tactics were based on constant pressure on the opponent. Step by step, he approached the enemy, methodically waiting for the right moment to launch a surprise attack. His fighting style closely resembled the actions of Roman infantry. He advanced with his shield raised, gradually blocking the opponent's space to maneuver and forcing him to retreat. At a certain point, the gladius made a sharp lunge, precise and deadly. But this style had its weaknesses and vulnerabilities. The large and heavy shield significantly limited mobility, and the heavy helmet made it difficult to see what was happening around him. The exposed legs became an easy target for enemy attacks. Mirmilones had a particularly hard time in duels against Thracians, the very fighters whose weapons were specifically designed to bypass shields and strike at the legs. That is why the fights between Mirmilones and Thracians were among the most popular and spectacular in the gladiatorial arena. It was a classic confrontation of strength versus speed, reliable armor versus incredible agility. The public watched with delight as the Mirmillo patiently waited for the right moment to attack, and then swiftly delivered a devastating blow, deciding the outcome of the duel with one precise and calculated movement. Next, we will take a detailed look at who the Retiarii are and why their battles with the Mirmilones were considered the most unusual and exciting in the gladiatorial arena. The Romans loved spectacles, but especially valued bright and contrasting performances. That is why fights between Retiarii and heavily armed gladiators were extremely popular with the public. One of them is agile, fast, and virtually defenseless. The other is massive, clad in armor, with a huge shield and helmet. The Retiarius looked almost defenseless and vulnerable in the arena. He had no helmet, no armor, not even a shield. Instead, he was armed with a net, a trident, and a dagger. He resembled a hunter stalking his prey, but at the same time he was in an incredibly vulnerable position himself. His net is not just a weapon, but his only chance of survival. He had to throw it accurately at the opponent to wrap him up and deprive him of the ability to move freely. If he succeeded, then the duel was practically won. All that remained was to deliver the decisive blow with the trident. But if the opponent managed to dodge or break free from the net, the Retiarius was left alone with an armed enemy. He had no reliable protection, only a metal arm guard on his arm and a small plate on his shoulder covering his neck. Everything else depended on his speed, agility, and ability to dodge blows. He could not afford the slightest mistake. If he fell or found himself in the corner of the arena, it was all over. Most often, Retiarii fought Mirmilones, who were their complete opposites in fighting style and weaponry. It was a confrontation of strength versus speed, a heavy shield versus a sharp trident. The public watched with bated breath as the Retiarius circled his opponent, waited for the right moment to attack, and made a sudden throw of the net. And each time the net missed its mark, the tension in the arena would ratchet up to an unbearable level. If the Mirmillo managed to seize the initiative and began to press the Retiarius, the latter had virtually no chance of survival. His only recourse was to skillfully dodge blows, lead his opponent around, and stall for time, relying on his speed and agility. Some Retiarii would even try to provoke the crowd, hoping that the spectators would start cheering them on, demanding to give the fighter another chance. It was a true theatrical performance, played out on the gladiatorial stage. A battle in which one fighter charged headlong, relying on brute strength and power, while the other was forced to fight with cunning, speed, and cold calculation. If the Retiarius was a nimble and cunning hunter, then the Secutor was a dangerous predator, created specifically to counter Retiarii. Every element of his equipment was designed to negate the advantages of his light and fast opponent. On the arena, the Secutor looked quite unusual, even by gladiatorial standards. Unlike other fighters, his helmet lacked a crest and had a smooth, rounded surface, and the visor had only 2 small eye slits. This unusual helmet shape was no accident. It served as protection against the net. If the Retiarius tried to cast his net over the Secutor's head, it would simply slide off the smooth helmet and miss its target. The Secutor's weaponry was standard, a short gladius and a huge rectangular shield which covered most of his body, allowing him to slowly approach the Retiarius, blocking his trident attacks. But despite his massive protection, the Secutor was quite agile and mobile. Unlike the murmillo, he wore a lighter helmet and could move faster so as not to allow the retiarius to escape. The fight between the retiarius and the secutor was a real cat-and-mouse game. The retiarius ran around the arena, trying to ensnare the secutor with his net, keeping him at bay with his trident and avoiding close combat at all costs. The secutor, step by step, closed the distance, patiently waiting for the moment when his opponent would misstep, stumble, or make some other mistake. As soon as the retiarius was within the secutor's reach, everything was decided in a matter of seconds. Next, we will discover what the rarest and most unusual types of gladiators looked like, those who occasionally appeared in the arena to amaze the public. The crowd was used to secutors, murmillos, and retiarii. These fighters appeared in the arena most often, and the spectators knew what to expect from their fights. But sometimes the doors of the gladiatorial gates would open, and fighters would emerge onto the sand who did not fit into the usual categories and struck the imagination with their unusual appearance. They did not appear often, but each of their appearances turned into a real event, which remained in the memory of the spectators for a long time. The hoplomachus looked as if he had just arrived from a real battlefield. He carried a spear and a small round shield. His helmet resembled the headgear of Greek warriors, and on his legs were protective greaves. He resembled the ancient hoplites, from whom he got his name. His fighting style was based on maintaining distance. He tried to strike his opponent with a spear, not letting him get too close. If the spear broke or fell from his hands, he would draw a short sword and engage in close combat. Most often, hoplomachi fought against murmillos, playing out on the arena the eternal battle between Greece and Rome. In contrast, provocatores were gladiators for fights on equal terms. Their task was not to pit speed against armor or agility against strength, but to pit two fighters with virtually identical equipment against each other. A distinctive feature of their gear was the armor on their chest, which was a rarity among gladiators, who most often fought without any torso protection. They used a gladius and a rectangular shield, and their helmet did not have a pronounced crest. Provocateur fights resembled duels, in which technique, skill, and the ability to outwit the opponent played a decisive role, rather than the features of armor. There was no room for unexpected maneuvers or cunning tricks. The one who wielded the sword better and knew how to anticipate the opponent's actions won. Equites fought on horseback. Their duels began with a charge. Two horsemen raced towards each other, holding spears and trying to knock down their opponent with the first blow. But even if the battle did not end immediately, it did not lose its sharpness and tension. Sometimes one of the gladiators ended up on the ground, while the second continued the fight on horseback. Sometimes both fell from their horses, and the fight turned into an ordinary sword fight. The equites wore light armor, and their helmets were equipped with wide brims so as not to obstruct their view. And yet, the most unusual among the rare types of gladiators was the dimachus. Unlike the others, he did not use a shield. Instead, he had two swords. This fighting style required a completely different preparation and special skill. The dimachus could not block, could not defend himself as other gladiators did. Instead, he constantly attacked, forcing his opponent to defend himself and deflect continuous blows. Each of his strikes could come from any side, and his enemy had to react to two threats at once. It was a style built on aggression, pressure, and constant pressure, but if the dimachus made a mistake, he had nothing to protect him. These gladiators appeared in the arena much less often than the classic fighters, but when they came out, the public froze in anticipation of something unusual. Their fights went beyond the usual ideas about gladiatorial combat. They did not just fight, they showed the public gladiatorial games from a completely different side, proving time and again that the arena is not only strength, but also tactics, cunning, and the ability to use one's strengths. Each battle in the arena followed strict rules. Each duel had its own meaning and pursued a specific goal. When a gladiator came out onto the sand, he did not wave his weapon blindly, but entered into a carefully staged battle in which everything was part of a grandiose performance. The popular myth that gladiators mercilessly killed each other for the amusement of the crowd is far from reality. They cost too much. They were taught, trained, fed, and treated after injuries sustained in battles. A good fighter could perform for years, becoming a favorite of the public and bringing huge income to his owner. The loss of an experienced and popular gladiator was a serious financial blow. Of course, blood flowed like a river in the arena, but every gladiator killed was a minus in the organizer's wallet. But if they tried to save the gladiators, then who was killed in the arena? Those who were released against wild animals were doomed to certain death. These were not real gladiators. They were not prepared for battle and were not taught any techniques. Criminals, slaves, and people sentenced to a painful death were thrown into the arena. Sometimes they were not even armed, but simply given a stick or a dagger that could not pierce the thick hide of a predator. Extremely dangerous animals were used for these purposes, such as lions, tigers, bears, rhinos, and elephants. Other convicts also had no chance of survival. They were forced to fight each other until the last survivor. If one of them showed extraordinary resilience and courage, he could be left alive, but this happened extremely rarely. However, real gladiators died only in special cases. They could die in battle if the organizer of the games decided that the spectacle required a sacrifice. Sometimes, if a warrior fought too cowardly or violated the established rules, he was sentenced to death. The fate of the loser was determined by the founder of the games, who decided with a gesture whether he should live or die. If the organizer of the games wanted to show mercy, the gladiator was given the opportunity to continue his career and return to the arena. If he considered the duel too boring and uninteresting, or the fighter did not show enough valor and courage, he could demand a finishing blow, thereby ending the gladiator's life. The crowd had the right to express its opinion, but did not have real power. It could shout, demand mercy, or conversely, thirst for death. But the last word always remained with the organizer of the games, who made the final decision. But even if a gladiator managed to survive in battle, it did not mean that he remained unscathed. The injuries and mutilations he received could leave him disabled for the rest of his life. Deep wounds often led to blood poisoning and death from infection. Some fighters died in the infirmary, where doctors desperately tried to save them after difficult fights. But the most important thing was that there were clear and strict rules in every battle, which had to be strictly observed. The arena did not turn into a chaotic and disorderly slaughter, where everything was decided by a random blow. Each pair of fighters was selected in such a way that the duel was as tense, exciting, and interesting as possible for the audience. A light and fast gladiator with a short curved sword against a heavily armed opponent capable of withstanding several serious injuries. A fighter with a net, deftly circling his opponent while he tried to guess from which side the attack would follow. A gladiator with a spear, reminiscent of an ancient Greek warrior. All this was a carefully planned confrontation in which not only brute force played an important role, but also cunning strategy. But one way or another, the arena lived with emotions. There was no pre-written script here, which meant that the outcome of each battle always remained a mystery and kept the audience in suspense. A gladiator could turn defeat into a brilliant victory, could withstand a seemingly hopeless situation when no one believed in his success. Or, on the contrary, take just one wrong step, make the slightest mistake, and it was all over. Rome knew how to turn murder into a kind of art. Each fight followed certain rules, but in these rules there was always room for improvisation and unexpected twists. There were demonstrative battles that exactly copied famous historical battles. There were mass battles, where dozens or even hundreds of fighters were released into the arena at once. Sometimes, a single gladiator would battle multiple opponents if they were a true legend, capable of standing alone against an entire army. The more spectacular and thrilling the performance, the easier it was to distract the populace from hunger, debt, and political intrigues. The more artful the production, the more influence its organizer gained in the eyes of both the Roman elite and the common people. But all of this only worked as long as the gladiators obeyed the established rules, as long as the fighters played the game, where they were mere pawns in the hands of Roman rulers, used for entertainment and to divert attention from pressing issues. Rome loved gladiatorial games so much that an entire industry formed around these spectacles, with vast sums of money circulating within it. Thousands of people lived off the battles in the arena, not by fighting, but by profiting from the blood and suffering of others. These people may never have held a sword, but without them, the gladiatorial arena could not have existed. The Lanistae, the owners of the gladiator schools, wielded the greatest power in this business. In modern terms, they might be called sports managers or promoters, but in reality, they were something between entrepreneurs, adventurers, and pimps. They bought people, trained them, and then sent them to fight in the arena, hoping their investments would yield a profit. To them, a gladiator was merely a commodity to be sold, traded, or lost in battle. In the eyes of the Roman elite, Lanistae were considered low-born, dirty merchants who profited from blood and suffering. Senators might enjoy gladiatorial games, finance the fights, even use gladiators in their political intrigues, but engaging in their training was considered beneath their dignity. And the Lanistae didn't just engage in it. They built entire schools where slaves were transformed into ruthless and well-trained fighters. But among them was one Lanista whose name would be forever remembered. Lentulus Batiatus was a man who left behind no great victories or resounding achievements, but he went down in history as the owner of that very gladiator school in Capua from which the legendary Spartacus escaped. He kept hundreds of gladiators, carefully monitored their training, and sold the best fighters to Roman magistrates and organizers of gladiatorial games. He knew the value of each of his gladiators, but he failed to notice that something more than just a thirst for glory and profit was brewing in his school. In ancient Rome, all power rested on three pillars: the army, money, and spectacle. The emperors realized that it was easy to distract the people from pressing problems and crises if they were given two main things: bread and thrilling gladiatorial games. When unrest and discontent flared up in the city, it was enough to announce grandiose competitions in the arena, and thousands of people forgot about hunger, exorbitant taxes, and military defeats consumed by the spectacle and bloodlust. Emperors competed with each other, staging ever more massive and spectacular shows that astounded the public. One might flood the arena with water and stage a real naval battle. Another, release hundreds of exotic animals brought from faraway lands for the fight. All of this was presented as an act of generosity and care for the people, but in reality, it was just a way to keep them under control and distract them from real problems. Nero, who loved to present himself as a people's emperor, not only staged gladiatorial games, but also generously distributed free tickets, gold, and valuable gifts to the audience. For him, every spectator was a potential admirer who could be bought, thereby strengthening his power. And Commodus went even further. He himself went out into the gladiatorial arena to show the people that he was the same kind of warrior as the gladiators, ready to risk his life for the common good. This was carefully crafted propaganda aimed at strengthening personal power and creating a positive image in the eyes of ordinary citizens. But most importantly, huge sums of money always circulated in this industry, attracting adventurers and swindlers of all kinds. Gladiatorial games were impossible to imagine without gambling. Enormous sums of money were wagered on every fight. Wealthy Romans spent fortunes hoping to guess the winner, while the poor could risk their last money, hoping to get rich at someone else's death. But where there's big money, there's always room for fraud and scams. Even in those distant times, there were prototypes of modern bookmakers who sold sure predictions, bribed judges, and made deals with gladiator school owners to get the desired results of the fights. If a fight could be rigged, it was always rigged. Wealthy sponsors invested huge sums of money in gladiators, expecting a profit. Some financed gladiators for fame and prestige, while others did so to buy them out after victories and resell them at a higher price to other owners. The best fighters became like valuable racehorses kept in the stable. They were traded, passed from hand to hand, and they were proud of them as a valuable acquisition. The more Rome became dependent on gladiatorial games, the more politics appeared in the arena. Influential senators used gladiatorial combats to demonstrate their power and wealth. Powerful generals financed gladiatorial schools to acquire loyal and well-trained fighters, and cunning emperors closely monitored to ensure that no one gathered too many armed warriors in one place, fearing conspiracies and rebellions. And while some enjoyed the spectacle, placed bets, and applauded bloody victories, others turned gladiatorial combat into one of the most profitable businesses in the Roman Empire. Some gladiators entered the arena only once, disappearing forever into the sands of the Colosseum, leaving behind only memory and spilled blood. Others burned through their lives in continuous battles, one after another, gradually becoming favorites of the crowd and true legends of the gladiatorial arena. The most skilled and fortunate of them survived dozens of bloody clashes and became famous in every corner of the Roman Empire. Let's get acquainted with some of the most famous gladiators whose names are forever etched in the history of ancient Rome. The story of Flamma is the story of a warrior to whom fate gave a chance to start a new life as many as 4 times, but he refused it each time. Flamma was a secutor, armed with a short gladius sword and protected by a huge shield and a smooth helmet that covered his entire face. He was a fighter who relied on endurance, gradually moving towards his opponent, reliably shielding himself from attacks with his shield and delivering a deadly blow at the decisive moment. Over his career, he fought 34 times, an incredible number for a gladiator whose life constantly hung by a thread. He had 21 clear victories, ended the fight in a draw 9 times and lost 4 times, but was pardoned by the public. 4 times he was granted the right to freedom and was awarded a wooden sword, symbolizing liberation from slavery. And 4 times he refused this generous gift. Perhaps he just didn't see himself outside the arena and couldn't imagine another life. Perhaps he enjoyed the fame, the crowd's delight, and the thrill of battle that made his blood boil. But when Flamma died, Rome remembered him forever as one of the most outstanding and courageous gladiators. But not every gladiator entered the arena to fight other people. Some fought with swords in hand, while others with claws and fangs. Carpophorus was a bestiarius, a fighter specializing in battles with wild animals. His arena was not where swords clashed, but where lions, bears, bulls, and panthers were released. He didn't wear heavy armor that restricted movement. He needed incredible reaction speed and agility. It was said that he killed 20 wild beasts in one day. He was released against enraged bulls, huge rhinoceroses, and even fierce leopards capable of tearing a man to shreds. Sometimes he fought several predators at once, demonstrating feats of courage and endurance. He was compared to the mythological hero Hercules, so incredible were his exploits. But bestiarii fights were the most dangerous and cruel, even by the standards of gladiatorial games, where death was always nearby. A man could kill dozens of wild beasts, but one day he would face one that would be faster, stronger, and more merciless. And then the gladiatorial arena accepted a new dead hero whose bones would soon be lost in the sands of the Colosseum. Carpophorus disappeared without a trace from the Roman chronicles, which can only mean one thing. Either he left the arena, managing to escape certain death, or he met his ignominious end in the claws of another wild beast that he could not withstand. Rome respected the strong, and sometimes a gladiator's strength and courage led him to the heights of power and wealth. Spartacus was a murmillo. These warriors relied on patience and endurance, slowly approaching their opponent, waiting for the right moment to strike a fatal blow. But his fights were not just brutal duels, but real theatrical shows, carefully directed and staged with grandeur because his patron was Emperor Nero himself. The emperor was known for his passionate love of gladiators. He staged grandiose fights and generously financed gladiatorial games, seeking to win the love and recognition of the people. And among all the gladiators, he singled out Spartacus, showering him with generous gifts. He gave him luxurious palaces, fertile lands, and untold riches. A gladiator who was supposed to lead a miserable existence in a cramped and dirty cage suddenly found himself a rich man, surrounded by luxury and universal admiration. But Nero's reign ended tragically. When the emperor was overthrown, his favorites and close associates faced an unenviable fate. Spartacus was not given a second chance and was not allowed to escape his deserved punishment. He did not wait for the shameful execution and voluntarily committed suicide, preferring death to dishonor. The names of the most skilled gladiators echoed throughout the Roman Empire. Their victories were immortalized in poems and songs, and their stories were passed down through generations, becoming the stuff of legends and myths. The most celebrated and fortunate fighters, upon earning their long-awaited freedom, could even enter into lawful matrimony with Roman women, despite their humble origins. In their honor, tombstones were erected, bearing their names and accounts of all their triumphs in the arena. Rome held in high esteem those who knew how to fight and did not fear death. But this respect was conditional, lasting only as long as they remained a part of the brutal spectacle. A gladiator could ascend to the status of a true legend, embody courage and valor, and even amass great wealth, but he would always remain a person whom the audience might one day clamor to see slain, their thirst for blood and entertainment unquenched. Yet, should he meet his end with dignity, leaving behind a heroic narrative, his name would not be swallowed by the abyss of time, but would endure in the memory of the people, inspiring them to acts of bravery. Each gladiator had a destiny uniquely his own. Some perished in the arena, never knowing happiness or freedom. Others reveled in luxury and universal adoration, while still others, like Spartacus, desired neither, yearning for something beyond the mere amusement of the Roman crowd. He had no intention of becoming a cog in the Roman entertainment machine. Instead, he aspired to liberty and justice. When gladiators died, their names transformed into heroic tales, recounted from mouth to mouth. But when they rose in revolt, they became a nightmare for Rome. The uprising led by Spartacus became the Roman Empire's most excruciating headache, escalating into a full-blown war in which the gladiators demonstrated what they were capable of when stripped of everything but their yearning for freedom. Before Spartacus became an icon of the fight for freedom, he was just an ordinary man. Or at least, that is how Rome wanted to perceive him. Virtually everyone knows of Spartacus, yet the more we strive to understand who he truly was, the more contradictions and inconsistencies we uncover in historical sources. Different authors offer differing accounts of his origins and life, leaving unanswered the question of who he really was. If Plutarch is to be believed, Spartacus hailed from Thrace, a region encompassing modern-day Bulgaria, Turkey, and Greece. He might have been a warrior from one of the Thracian tribes, only to be captured by the Romans and sold into a gladiatorial school. Another version exists, claiming that he served in the Roman army prior to his capture, which could elucidate his tactical acumen, his ability to organize people, and his profound understanding of Roman warfare strategy. Perhaps he was a soldier in one of the legions who deserted and was apprehended by the Romans. Roman authors writing about Spartacus had no interest in turning him into a hero or glorifying his name. They branded him a barbarian, a rebel, and an enemy of the Roman Empire. Yet, even they acknowledged that he was a man of extraordinary intellect and strength, a man who could raise an army from those who had never even dreamed of freedom, inspiring them to fight against mighty Rome. When Spartacus entered the gladiatorial school, he found himself in a confined world governed by strength, discipline, and fear. The gladiatorial school in Capua, owned by Lentulus Batiatus, was considered one of the best in Italy. Its owner was a man who knew the ins and outs of this brutal business. He bought people, trained them, and then sold or leased them out, profiting from every strike of a sword and every drop of spilled blood. Ludus Batiatus was a place where an ordinary person was transformed into a ruthless fighter trained to kill. They arrived here by various means. Some were brought in chains, others were bought at slave markets like livestock. Still others came of their own accord, voluntarily signing a contract for money, fame, or out of desperation. But once they stepped through the gates of the gladiatorial school, their past remained behind. Now, everyone faced only one choice: to become a weapon in the hands of the lanista, or to break under the weight of harsh discipline and constant fear. In Capua, gladiators did not languish in dark dungeons or starve, as is often depicted in films. They lived in barracks, received nourishing food and necessary medical care to recover as quickly as possible from strenuous training and bloody battles. But this was merely a cold and cynical calculation. A gladiator was a valuable commodity, and a commodity had to be in good condition and generate profit for its owner. Unlike ordinary slaves who were sent to mines or for strenuous labor in agriculture, gladiators were given a chance to survive, not for themselves, but so that they could fight in the arena and entertain the Roman public. The morning began with the deafening sound of a stick striking the door of the barracks. Dawn had barely touched the tops of the walls when gladiators were already being driven out for grueling training, barely allowing them to wake up. The first ordeal was running. It was a grueling march with a heavy load on their shoulders, a test of endurance and willpower. With sacks filled with sand or logs that had to be dragged until their legs stopped feeling the ground and refused to obey. After running, weapon drills began. In the center of the training ground stood wooden posts covered with scars from thousands upon thousands of blows. Each gladiator had to strike the same spot over and over until the muscles no longer felt fatigue and the strikes became automatic. Sparring sessions continued until the first fall, until complete exhaustion. There was no room for mercy, no right to retreat, no excuses. If you missed a blow, tomorrow it would be a real one, and you would pay for your mistake with blood. If you didn't learn to reliably cover yourself with a shield, it would sooner or later be pierced, and an enemy sword would plunge into your body. If you couldn't protect your leg, a sharp blade would sink into it, depriving you of the ability to move. Mistakes here were corrected not with words, but with unbearable pain. Lunch gave the fighters a brief respite, allowing them to catch their breath and regain their strength. Gladiators were not fed meat and delicacies, but simple yet nutritious food necessary to maintain their strength. Porridge, bread, vegetables, and legumes. Nothing superfluous, but just enough to keep the muscles working and the body enduring the blows. Wine and olive oil were reserved only for the best of the best, those who already stood in the upper ranks and brought profit to their owner. After lunch, the second, no less grueling round of training began, including obstacle courses, weighted striking drills, shield exercises, and lunge practice. In the evening, when the body refused to obey, when every muscle ached from tension and fatigue, the final test arrived: striking drills with a weighted sword. Muscles burned, arms trembled with weariness, but tomorrow the movements would become faster and more precise. Those who could not cope with the load could not count on leniency or mercy. Any weakness was mercilessly punished. Wooden sticks, whips, solitary confinement for those who tried to argue and show defiance. Rebels disappeared without a trace. The next day, no one even asked where they had gone or what had happened to them. but those who showed strength, courage, and perseverance opened other doors leading to a better life. Gladiator could be cruel and ruthless, but he knew the value of his fighters and could distinguish promising gladiators from weaklings. He rewarded the best of them, giving them the opportunity to earn money, bet on their own fights, buy themselves women, and order more varied and delicious food. They could live better than other gladiators, but they could not leave the school and gain freedom. There was only one way out: the gladiatorial arena. It was there that their fate was decided. There either came the long-awaited fame and wealth, or there came inevitable and inglorious death. Gladiators spent a lot of time together, but were very different people, united only by common misfortune and hatred for their oppressors. Among them were those who desperately dreamed of escape and freedom. Some thirsted for revenge for the suffering inflicted, while others dreamed of power and wealth. They came from different places, each with their own past and their own personal scores to settle with the Roman Empire. They were united only by hatred for their enslavers and a desire to change their lives. When the conspiracy was just beginning to take shape in Capua, people appeared alongside Spartacus, who played a key role in this historical event. Oenomaus was one of those gladiators who were respected and whose opinion was listened to. A senior gladiator who had survived dozens of bloody battles in the arena, he knew perfectly well how this cruel world was arranged and understood all its laws. He had seen hundreds of people come to the gladiatorial school to undergo training, and had seen them carried away from the arena, where they disappeared without a trace in blood and sand. He understood perfectly well that there was no way out of the ludus, and the whole system was designed so that no one could break free and escape their fate. But when he had the opportunity to strike at this system from within and try to break it, he did not stand aside and joined the conspirators. Thanks to his authority and influence among the other fighters, it was he who helped Spartacus organize the conspiracy and rally like-minded people around him. This was not a mindless outburst of rage and despair. The uprising required clear organization, strict discipline, detailed preparation, and coordinated actions of all participants. Oenomaus maintained order among the gladiators, ensured that they stuck together, and did not reveal their plans. If Spartacus was the brain of this uprising, then Oenomaus was his main support and right-hand man. But he was not destined to see how it would all end. He died in one of the first clashes with Roman troops, which was a serious loss for the rebel gladiators. By that point, the gladiator army was no longer just a bunch of fugitives consumed by a thirst for revenge, but his death reminded everyone that this war would not end peacefully, and they would have to fight to the end. Crixus was a completely different person. A tall and broad-shouldered Gaul, for whom in battle there was only one path: forward, knowing no fear or doubt. He did not believe in complex tactical calculations and saw no point in caution or foresight. Unlike Spartacus, he was not looking for salvation or a safe exit from Italy, but only craved revenge on his oppressors. He dreamed of seeing the luxurious villas of Roman patricians crumble, of legionnaires fleeing in panic from enraged gladiators, and of the Colosseum arena filled with Roman blood, spilled for all the suffering inflicted. As the army of rebellious gladiators grew, joined by escaped slaves, deserters, and peasants, discord began to grow between Spartacus and Crixus, stemming from differing views on the future war strategy. When the insurgent gladiators became a formidable force capable of standing up to Roman troops, it became necessary to decide what to do next and where to move. Spartacus understood that the Roman Empire could not be defeated in open warfare. The Roman legions were too numerous and well-trained, and any victory won by the rebellious gladiators could only be temporary and would not bring long-awaited freedom. He wanted to lead his people out of Italy, cross into the lands beyond the Alps, where they could disappear among the barbarian tribes and finally find long-awaited freedom. Crixus did not understand these arguments and did not share Spartacus's views. He yearned for a campaign against Rome, wanted to destroy the empire he hated, wipe it off the face of the earth, and end Roman domination forever. At some point, their paths diverged. Crixus led away part of the gladiator army, those who also did not want to flee and hide, but only craved to fight and take revenge. And soon after, he tragically died. Roman legions surrounded his detachment and slaughtered everyone to the last man, leaving not a single gladiator alive. The heads of the fallen gladiators were impaled on spears and displayed along the roads to show Spartacus and his army what fate awaited them in case of defeat. Another true companion of Spartacus was Gannicus. He was not interested in power, political intrigue, or complex military strategies. He lived only for battle, seeing in it the sole meaning of his existence. If it was necessary to attack the enemy, he was always in the front, leading his comrades. If an assault on a fortified position was required, he took command of the assault detachment. If a risky and dangerous plan appeared, he was the first to volunteer to carry it out, without thinking about the consequences. Cool-headed and fearless, he remained by Spartacus's side until the very end, sharing all the hardships and deprivations with him. Fighters followed only those they respected and trusted, and respect came only through strength, courage, and personal example. In Batiatus's ludus, only one cruel rule prevailed: the strongest wins, and the weak die, unable to withstand the competition. Spartacus understood when to wait and build up strength, and when to deliver a precise and crushing blow, not allowing the enemy to come to their senses. He did not try to force others to submit to his will. He proved by his example that with him they would have a better chance of surviving and finding long-awaited freedom. He did not talk about freedom, but gave hope for it, instilling in people's hearts the belief that everything could still be changed. Slave escapes from Rome happened quite often, but usually they did not pose a serious threat to the state. But the Gladiator uprising, which escalated into a protracted and bloody war, came as a complete surprise to the Romans. The rebellious gladiators did not simply escape from the school. They went beyond its walls with weapons in hand and immediately became a formidable military force capable of standing up to the Roman legions. What began as a desperate attempt to escape and break free turned into one of the most serious and resounding threats to the Roman Republic, bringing it to the brink of collapse. Batiatus's ludus was organized in such a way as to exclude even the slightest possibility of escape. High and impregnable walls, armed guards vigilantly watching every step of the gladiators, and a strict daily routine that left no time to prepare for escape. The gladiators were not kept in shackles and chains, but their freedom of movement was severely restricted and under constant control. It was impossible to leave the school gates on one's own, only in a chain and only to the gladiator arena, to fight and die for the entertainment of the Roman public. However, it was precisely the absence of overt and obvious coercion and mistreatment that became a weak point in the system which Spartacus exploited. Rumors about preparations for a conspiracy began to spread among the gladiators. Some discussed possible action plans, some watched the guards and identified their weaknesses, and some knew where to get weapons and how to use them. Apparently, information about the impending uprising leaked to the Romans too early, revealing the conspirators' plans. How the Romans learned about the conspiracy remains unknown to this day. Perhaps one of the gladiators spoke carelessly, or the guards noticed suspicious activity among the fighters. Whatever the case, harsh measures were immediately taken against the conspirators. The Roman authorities' plan was simple: to capture the instigators of the rebellion, subject them to brutal interrogation, and punish them demonstratively so that others would not be tempted to rebel. Dealing with a few hundred gladiators was not a particular problem for the Romans. The gladiators, of course, were deadly and well-trained fighters, but they were still slaves, accustomed to obeying and carrying out orders. A few lashes of the whip, and this miserable rebellion would dry up on its own, like a stream in the desert. But it all turned out quite differently, and the Romans severely miscalculated, underestimating the gladiators' strength of spirit. When the guards stormed into the barracks, the gladiators already knew that they were facing imminent death. Now there was no choice. Either attack first and try to break free, or passively await their fate and die at the hands of Roman executioners. The fight began suddenly and fiercely, giving the gladiators no time to think or prepare. The main problem for the fugitives was the lack of weapons. Combat equipment was stored in locked warehouses, access to which was given only before training or before battles in the arena. Everything that was at hand had to be used as a weapon. Gladiators grabbed kitchen knives, iron skewers, sticks, and pieces of furniture, turning them into formidable weapons. Some tore metal rods from beds and made them into sword-like weapons. Others used stones and clay pots as primitive throwing weapons. The guards, armed with swords and spears, were not prepared for such fierce resistance and suffered the first losses. Unlike Roman soldiers, the gladiators did not fight in formation or according to any regulations. Each fought as they were used to doing in the arena, deadly fast, unpredictably, and without a single mistake, knowing that their life depended on it. Some of the fighters fell in a fierce battle with the Roman guards, but most still managed to break free. The guards could not stop the onslaught of enraged gladiators, thirsty for blood and revenge. Chaos reigned in the ludus, and soon the doors, which the Romans considered a reliable barrier to freedom, were thrown open. Having escaped beyond the walls of the gladiator school, the fugitives faced a new problem. The escape itself meant nothing and did not guarantee them salvation. If they scattered in different directions, the Roman legions would catch them one by one and deal with each of them cruelly. They had to act differently to survive and resist the mighty Roman Empire. They moved to where they could find real weapons and equipment needed to wage war. Nearby was a military convoy, a Roman supply caravan guarded by a small detachment of soldiers. The gladiator detachment suddenly attacked it, and with practically no resistance, seized swords, shields, and armor, turning from unarmed fugitives into a real army, posing a serious threat to Rome. The first Roman troops sent against the rebels expected to see a scattered and poorly armed crowd of slaves, seized by panic and fear. But the gladiators did not scatter and did not flinch, but bravely engaged in battle and won a convincing victory over the Roman soldiers, proving their strength and determination. This escape and the subsequent attack on Roman troops marked the beginning of a real and bloody war that changed the course of history. But the fugitives did not yet have a clear military structure at that point. In the first hours after the uprising, the gladiators were simply a group of armed people fighting for their lives and freedom. In such chaos, power could pass to anyone who gave the loudest order and gathered around them the strongest and most influential fighters. But in the end, the center of this new army became Spartacus, who possessed unquestionable authority and the ability to make the right decisions in the most difficult situations. This was not accidental or the result of a conspiracy. The gladiators did not obey authority by right of birth or position. They looked only at strength, courage, and the ability to survive in the most extreme conditions. And Spartacus was exactly the person who understood what awaited them ahead and how to act correctly to avoid imminent death. Crixus, who by that time had already gained respect and recognition among the fighters, thought differently. For him, the uprising was not a war for freedom, but an opportunity to avenge his enemies for all the suffering they had caused. He was strong, brave, and courageous, but he did not know how to wait and calculate his actions several steps ahead. For Crixus, every battle was a crushing blow that should destroy the enemy. But in conditions where entire legions of Roman soldiers had already been sent after the fugitives, and when the first misstep could be the end of the entire uprising, Such a reckless approach was deadly dangerous and could lead to catastrophic consequences. Wenemaus, an elder and wise gladiator, could have become a true mentor for all the rebels, but unfortunately died during the escape from the gladiator school. But if he had managed to survive, his role in the gladiator army could have been quite different. Perhaps he would have become something like a trainer for new fighters, organizing their training and maintaining order in the ranks of the rebels. But fate decreed otherwise, and Wenemaus could not fully share with his comrades their difficult path to freedom. Spartacus did not view war as a senseless revolt, but as a complex path to victory, demanding precise planning and strict discipline. He understood the need for clear organization, that one could not go far on a single captured caravan, and that every subsequent step had to be carefully considered to avoid inevitable defeat. He did not need formal recognition. The fighters themselves saw in him a leader who looked further than the rest and was capable of leading them to freedom. After their escape from Capua, the gladiators found themselves in a completely new and unfamiliar world, simultaneously their salvation and a deadly trap. Within the walls of the ludus, they knew the daily routine, received food, and trained under the supervision of experienced instructors. Now, all of that was gone, and they had to fend for themselves and figure out how to survive in this hostile world. No one fed them or cared for their battle wounds. It would seem that long-awaited freedom had finally been achieved, but with it came the realization that each of them was now a target, hunted by Roman legions. The initial group of escapees numbered only around 70 fighters. This was far too few to battle the mighty Roman army. They could try to hide, scatter in different directions, or get lost among the slaves working in the fields. But Spartacus understood perfectly that solitary flight would lead to certain death. Rome controlled Italy with an iron fist, and it would not take much time or effort to capture a small group of rebels. However, if they became a formidable force to be reckoned with, their chances of survival would increase dramatically. The first to join the gladiators were runaway slaves who had fled their cruel masters. They did not know how to defend themselves and did not possess weapons, but they had the main motive for fighting, a burning hatred for their oppressors. Many of them saw the rebellious gladiators as their only hope for salvation and the opportunity to avenge their tormentors. Those who could not fight with weapons in hand helped the rebels in other ways, finding food, building shelters, and obtaining valuable information about the movements of Roman troops. Everyone knew that they would not be spared if they were put back in chains, and so there was no doubt they had to fight to their last breath. Next, peasants living on the outskirts and suffering from the tyranny of Roman governors began to join the rebelling gladiators. Poverty and the arbitrariness of local landowners made them implacable enemies of Rome, willing to do anything to change their lives for the better. Unlike slaves, peasants knew how to survive in the wild, had a good sense of direction in the mountains, knew where to find a water source and how to set up camp in the forest, protecting themselves from wild animals. They brought knowledge of the terrain to Spartacus's army, without which a long war in the mountains would have been simply impossible. Then, deserters fleeing from Roman legions began to join the rebels. The Roman legions included not only citizens of Rome, but also residents of the provinces, recruited forcibly or for the promise of a generous reward. Far from all of them shared Roman values and were willing to fight for the interests of the empire. When the war with the rebellious gladiators began to gain momentum, many of those who found themselves on the side of the Republic against their will began to switch to the side of the rebels, seeing them as their liberators. They brought with them weapons, armor, and most importantly, valuable knowledge of the enemy's tactics and strategy, helping the gladiators to effectively resist Roman troops. The army grew with each passing day. What began as a desperate escape by a small group of gladiators was gradually transforming into a powerful popular movement, into which flowed all those who saw no decent future for themselves in a world where Rome ruled supreme. But numbers alone were not enough to defeat the Roman Empire. Spartacus was not going to fight with a crowd of poorly armed people who would scatter in panic at the first attack of the Roman legionaries. He understood perfectly that without order, discipline, and clear organization, they would face inevitable defeat, and the uprising would be brutally suppressed. He had seen how the Romans fought as a unified and well-oiled machine where each warrior knew his place and carried out the orders of his commanders precisely. If the army of gladiators did not learn to act just as smoothly and organized, victory would be simply impossible. He did not try to blindly copy the Roman military model, understanding that their heavy armor restricted movement too much, strict formations took a lot of time, and training all his fighters in a state of war was simply unrealistic. Instead, he sought other, more effective ways of waging war, taking into account the characteristics of his army and the terrain. In Spartacus's army, there were no strict formations and standardized weapons, as in the Roman legions, but each warrior knew his role and carried out his assigned tasks clearly. The core of the army consisted of former gladiators and peasants. The former were natural-born killers, accustomed to bloody battles and unafraid of death. The latter were natural-born scouts, who knew the area well and could move quickly and unnoticed. They found shelters, tracked down the enemy, obtained valuable information, and led the army to places where they could set up ambushes and inflict maximum damage on the enemy. When the Romans sent the first legions against the rebelling gladiators, they expected to encounter an unorganized and poorly armed crowd of slaves, gripped by panic and fear. They were confident that runaway slaves would not be able to withstand the clash with professional warriors who had undergone rigorous military training and had participated in major battles more than once. But they were met by a very different enemy, who knew how to fight not only with strength, but also with cunning. Spartacus's army did not line up in neat rows and wait for the orders of the tribunes. It struck where it was not expected, disappeared before the enemy could regroup, and launched new attacks when the Romans thought the battle was already over. When the first Roman detachment sent to suppress the rebellion was completely defeated, Rome still did not fully realize the danger they were about to face and what consequences it could lead to. The rebelling gladiators could not fight the way the Romans did. Their army did not have heavy armor capable of protecting them from the blows of enemy weapons or cavalry capable of crushing the enemy with a swift onslaught. They could not count on a constant supply of food, weapons, and ammunition, or on forges and workshops where they could repair weapons and patch up shields pierced in battle. But they had what their enemies lacked: freedom of movement, courage, audacity, and the absence of rigid rules restricting their actions. The Roman army existed under a strict code. Soldiers fought in formation. Their actions were strictly regulated and subordinated to a clear command system. They were accustomed to strict discipline, to a slow and methodical advance, and to supporting each other in a unified formation. But if this well-oiled system failed, the Romans became disoriented and began to panic. Their battle formations crumbled, and in single combat, even an experienced legionary became vulnerable and easy prey for the enemy. Spartacus knew this perfectly well and skillfully exploited the weaknesses of the Roman army for his own purposes. The gladiators moved faster, attacked unexpectedly, and withdrew before the enemy could regroup and fight back. Their lightness and mobility became their main weapon and reliable protection. They used every moment, every mistake of the enemy, and the features of the terrain to turn the tide of battle in their favor and win. The Romans were accustomed to battles in which troops converged on an open field and began a bloody face-to-face clash, deciding the outcome of the battle in an honest duel. The rebels fought in a completely different way, using guerrilla warfare tactics. They set up ambushes, led false retreats, lured the enemy into narrow gorges and mountain passes, where the legionaries could not turn around and effectively use their numerical superiority, and destroyed them in small groups, giving them no chance of salvation. Where the Roman army expected to see a disorderly mob of rebels, They were met by a cohesive and well-organized striking force, appearing and disappearing like a ghost, not giving the enemy time to recover. The troops sent to suppress the rebellion were completely unprepared for such a war and could not adapt to the new conditions. They were trained for battles in open fields, where there was enough space to deploy a battle formation and effectively use their numerical superiority. They could not catch up with the gladiators and impose their conditions for battle, and the mountainous terrain where the rebels were hiding made them clumsy and vulnerable. When the Roman Senate discussed the first reports of the revolt in Capua, no one took them seriously. A small group of runaway slaves, according to Roman politicians, could not pose a serious threat to the Republic. They could easily be dispersed by small detachments, suppressed by force, as had happened dozens of times in the past. That is what they thought in Rome, and they were cruelly mistaken, underestimating their opponent. But a few months after the start of the uprising, the situation changed radically, and the Romans realized the full extent of the threat that had arisen. The gladiators had defeated several military expeditions sent against them, destroyed detachments of soldiers who were supposed to return them in chains to gladiatorial schools. They captured weapons, organized well-fortified camps, trained recruits, and replenished their ranks. Instead of a scattered and poorly armed mob of runaway slaves, Rome was faced with a real army capable of resisting the Roman legions. But even then, the Romans were in no hurry to send their best troops against Spartacus, underestimating the danger. A nationwide slave revolt seemed unthinkable and impossible. Politicians refused to believe that these people, despised by everyone, could withstand a serious clash with professional and well-trained Roman troops. As fierce debates raged in the Senate over who to send to war against the gladiators and what forces to allocate to suppress the rebellion, the insurgents continued their advance, seizing new cities and territories. Rome was too vast to concentrate all its might on quelling a single uprising. Its army was stretched across numerous provinces, and generals were waging wars in Hispania, Asia, and Gaul, expanding the empire's borders. Legions maintained control over vast territories, suppressed local revolts, and oversaw major cities. Rome possessed immense human and material resources, but lacked the available manpower to immediately halt Spartacus and bring the rebellion to an end. Rome attempted to suppress the gladiator uprising using the same methods it had employed to quell all previous slave revolts. But this time it was met with bitter disappointment. This war was entirely different, and the Romans faced an opponent they had clearly underestimated. It lasted a full 3 years, not because the Romans were weak or incompetent, but because Rome made a fatal error, fatally underestimating its enemy, his willpower, and his military talent. The first major clash between Roman forces and the rebel gladiators was the battle near Mount Vesuvius. The Romans blocked all avenues of retreat, hoping that the gladiators would either starve to death or be forced to surrender to the victor's mercy. But Spartacus had no intention of waiting for his fate while under siege. His fighters descended the steep and inaccessible slopes of the volcano at night and unexpectedly struck the Roman camp from the rear, causing panic and confusion among the Roman soldiers. The enemy camp was completely destroyed, and the Romans fled in terror, abandoning their weapons and equipment. But this was only the first victory, to be followed by new battles and trials. When Rome dispatched new forces, expecting to trap the rebels and destroy them with a single crushing blow, the legions encountered an unpleasant surprise. Spartacus's army had no intention of sitting under siege and awaiting its fate. It defeated its enemies piecemeal, preventing them from uniting and utilizing their numerical superiority. The Roman legions were slow, unwieldy, and heavily reliant on roads and established communications. The gladiators moved much faster, appearing where they were not expected, encircling the enemy and annihilating them in small groups, preventing them from regrouping and organizing a defense. In the battle near Mutina, the Romans suffered one of the most painful blows of the entire war. Spartacus confronted the army of proconsul Gaius Cassius Longinus and despite the enemy's significant numerical advantage, utterly routed his army, inflicting a heavy defeat on Rome. But even then, Rome did not realize the full gravity of the threat posed by the rebel gladiators. The Romans simply could not believe that this rebellion was not merely a brief outburst of rage and despair, but a well-planned and prepared war for which the gladiators had been preparing with intelligence and cold calculation. They could not admit that an army of slaves, which they did not take seriously, was repeatedly defeating their invincible legions, causing them to tremble with fear. While fierce debates continued in the Senate over who to place at the head of the military campaign and what forces to send against the rebels, Spartacus continued his advance, seizing new cities and territories. He crossed Italy from south to north, then turned back, stormed several major cities, plundered armories and supply depots, and defeated several Roman armies, proving his strength and military talent. But the rebellion could not last forever, and Spartacus knew this perfectly well. Spartacus understood that each victory only hastened the day when he would face a man who would not make the same mistakes as his predecessors. He knew that Rome had vast resources, and sooner or later someone would take responsibility for conducting this war and do everything possible to destroy his army. This man was Marcus Licinius Crassus, one of the wealthiest and most influential men in Rome, known for his cruelty and ruthlessness. Unlike those Roman commanders who had tried to defeat the gladiators before, Crassus was cruel, decisive, and merciless. He did not view the rebels as savages who could easily be dispersed by force. He saw them as a dangerous and well-organized enemy, which required complete and unconditional destruction, leaving no chance of survival. When Crassus took command of the Roman forces, the rules of this war changed, and it became even more brutal and bloody than before. At the beginning of the rebellion, there were no internal conflicts or disagreements in Spartacus's army. Everyone who joined the revolt understood that they had no other choice and would have to fight to the end. But the longer the war lasted, and the larger the rebel army grew, the more difficult it became to maintain unity in their ranks and avoid internal conflicts and disagreements. The first serious split occurred when part of the army wanted not to fight the Romans to the bitter end, but simply to leave Italy and start a new life far from the empire. Spartacus never sought pointless battles that were unnecessary. He understood that Rome would sooner or later gather all its forces and throw against them an army that would be very difficult to resist. His main goal was to get as many of his people as possible out of Italy, perhaps to go beyond the Alps, where Roman power was weaker, and start a new life in freedom. But not everyone shared Spartacus's views and was ready to leave Italy, abandoning revenge on their enemies. One of the strongest and most influential leaders among the gladiators was Crixus, distinguished by his reckless courage and thirst for revenge. He saw the war not merely as a way to escape from slavery, but as an opportunity to destroy as many Romans as possible in open battle, avenging them for all the suffering they had caused. He did not want to retreat and hide in the mountains, avoiding battles with the Roman troops. When Spartacus proposed leaving Italy and taking his army to a safe place, Crixus categorically refused and accused him of betraying the ideals of freedom and justice. He gathered his supporters and headed south to continue the war with Rome on his own, unwilling to consult with anyone. This decision cost him his life. Crixus could not withstand the well-trained and armed Roman army, and his detachment was completely crushed. Thousands of gladiators perished in unequal battle, defending their freedom. When Spartacus learned of Crixus's defeat, he did not rush into a senseless offensive to avenge his death, but later, when the Romans were celebrating their victory and did not expect an attack, he attacked their camp and destroyed an entire legion, avenging his comrades' deaths on his enemies. But Crixus was not the only one who caused discord in the ranks of the rebels. The longer the rebellion lasted, and the more people joined the gladiator army, the more its original character changed. In the first months, it was a small and close-knit fighting community where everyone knew each other and was ready to give their lives for their comrade. But after a year, the army numbered over 40,000 men, and far from all of them were disciplined fighters loyal to the ideals of freedom. The rebellion attracted those who wanted to loot, avenge, and destroy without thinking about the consequences. Each new detachment that joined the army came with its own views on the war and its own interests. Spartacus tried to maintain order and discipline in his army, but he physically could not control everything and keep track of every one of his fighters. When it became clear that Rome was preparing a new and crushing blow, some of the military leaders began to doubt whether it was worth staying with Spartacus and continuing the hopeless struggle against the Roman Empire. One of them was Castus, one of the most influential and wealthy gladiators. He and his men saw the war only as an opportunity to get rich and improve their financial situation. When it became clear that a general battle with Crassus was inevitable, they left Spartacus, deciding that it was better to go to the mountains and disperse to their homes than to die in an unequal battle with the Roman legions. Their departure significantly weakened the gladiator army at the most critical moment. But the heaviest blow for Spartacus was the betrayal of the pirates with whom he had formed an alliance. When the Roman troops began to close the ring around the rebels, Spartacus realized that the only way to escape was to leave Italy by sea and move to a safer place. He negotiated with the Cilician pirates, who promised to transport his army to Sicily, where it would be possible to launch a new uprising among the local slaves and continue the war on a new front. But when the rebels came to the coast, there were no ships to be found. The pirates took the money, but did not keep their promise, and deceived Spartacus. Perhaps they were frightened by the power of the Romans and did not want to get involved with such a dangerous enemy. Perhaps they simply did not find such an ally beneficial, and they decided to earn money by deception. In any case, the gladiator army found itself trapped, deprived of its last hope of salvation. By the time Rome finally realized the scale of the threat, the gladiator rebellion had been going on for 2 years and posed a serious danger to the empire. Legionaries suffered one defeat after another. The Roman provinces were in turmoil with rumors of rebels, and Spartacus's army moved freely through Italy, encountering practically no worthy resistance. The Senate long underestimated the rebellion, considering it a minor incident, but when it became clear that ordinary commanders could not cope with the situation, the case was taken up by a man for whom defeat was unacceptable. Marcus Licinius Crassus was one of the richest and most influential men in Roman history, possessing enormous power and political clout. A man who did not believe in coincidences and did not play politics, but made it, achieving his goals by any means. His vast fortune was built on cold calculation, tough pragmatism, and the ability to profit from any situation, and in war he adhered to the same principles, sparing neither himself nor his subordinates. When Crassus took command of the army, he inherited a tired, demoralized, and fragmented force that did not know how to defeat Spartacus and stop the gladiator rebellion. The first thing he did was restore strict discipline and order to the army. Among the legionaries, who had been fighting gladiators for 2 years, there was apathy, despondency, and a lack of confidence. They were used to defeats, had seen their comrades die in the forests and mountain gorges, and did not know how to turn the tide of the war. Crassus knew that the morale of the army could only be restored through fear and cruelty. Therefore, he applied an old and proven Roman method, decimation, which consisted of executing every 10th soldier in the failed detachments. Every 10th soldier was killed by his comrades without trial, without investigation, and without regard for merit. This brutal method worked flawlessly. The army was once again transformed into an obedient mechanism that unquestioningly followed orders, ready for any test. But Crassus understood that strict discipline was only the first step towards victory over Spartacus. He did not chase Spartacus through the mountains and forests, as his predecessors had done, and did not try to defeat his army with quick and sudden attacks. Instead, he acted logically and pragmatically by cutting off all possible escape routes for the gladiators and trapping them. When Spartacus's army found itself in southern Italy, Crassus ordered his troops to build a line of powerful fortifications, cutting off the rebels' path to the sea. Forts, deep trenches, high palisades, and watchtowers, all of this stretched across the narrow isthmus from sea to sea, leaving the gladiators no chance of escape. The rebels were trapped in a deadly trap. Now they could neither retreat nor maneuver, nor use their favorite tactics of sudden and daring strikes. For the first time in 3 years of war, Rome forced the rebellious gladiators to play by its rules, depriving them of freedom of action and initiative. Spartacus desperately tried to break through the Roman blockade and escape from the trap, but all his attempts were unsuccessful. The gladiator armies stormed the Roman fortifications several times, but Crassus foresaw all possible options and carefully prepared for defense. He did not allow his soldiers to scatter, held his positions, and methodically exhausted the rebels with powerful counterattacks, allowing them to weaken under the onslaught of the Roman legions. When Spartacus realized that it was impossible to break through the Roman defenses and escape from the trap, he made the only possible decision in the situation: to give the Romans a general battle in the open field. This was his last chance for victory, his last desperate answer to the Roman Empire. According to various sources, at this moment, Spartacus had between 30,000 and 50,000 fighters under his command, ready to give their lives for freedom. Crassus had several battle-hardened legions, trained and intimidated by the cruelty of their commander, ready to carry out any of his orders. The battle was monstrously fierce and bloody. The gladiators fought with the fury and desperation of those who understood that they would not have another chance to escape. They broke through the Roman ranks, tore apart their lines, and inflicted crushing blows that could have turned the tide of battle in their favor. But there were too few of them. Each Roman killed by a gladiator meant the appearance of a new line of shields behind him, ready to stop the rebel onslaught. Spartacus did not sit in the rear, giving orders to his commanders. He himself rushed into the thick of the battle, cutting his way through the ranks of the Roman legionaries and trying to reach Crassus himself. Roman chronicles claim that Spartacus tried to personally kill the Roman commander, understanding that this could turn the tide of the battle and bring victory to his army. But new and more enemies stood in his way, ready to give their lives to protect Crassus. When the gladiators fell, the battlefield was littered with the bodies of slain warriors. Those who were not killed immediately were taken prisoner and subjected to cruel tortures. Of the tens of thousands of rebels, only a few survived, miraculously avoiding death or capture. Spartacus's body was never found on the battlefield, and his fate remains a mystery to historians to this day. But even after the crushing defeat of the rebellion, there were still isolated groups of fugitives hiding in the mountains and forests. Some detachments of rebels broke into small groups and tried to break through to northern Italy to avoid capture and reprisal. Crassus was going to finish them off. But at that moment, Pompey the Great, a famous Roman general and politician who had won many victories in different parts of the world, triumphantly returned to Italy. Pompey did not take direct part in the war against Spartacus, but he wanted to take advantage of the situation to increase his popularity in Rome. It was his legionaries who caught and destroyed the last remnants of the gladiator army trying to break through to the north. He immediately sent a hypocritical report to Rome in which he wrote that it was he who put an end to the war with Spartacus, while Crassus only stained his hands with the blood of slaves. Crassus could not forgive Pompey for such meanness and an attempt to take away his triumph, but he could do nothing. In the eyes of the Roman people, Pompey was always a great commander and national hero, while Crassus remained only in second place in the shadow of his glory. The rebellion was suppressed, and the Roman Republic felt safe again. But now it was necessary to teach a cruel lesson to all those who might even think about a new rebellion against Rome. 6,000 prisoners who survived after the last battle were not sent to the mines and were not sold into slavery. All of them were crucified along the Appian Way, leading from Capua to Rome itself. For many miles, at every step, there was a cross with a crucified gladiator dying in agony. This was not just a cruel revenge on the rebellious slaves, it was a terrible warning to everyone else. Anyone who looked at this terrible road should have understood that rebellion against Rome was not forgiven, and one would have to pay the highest price for it. The Romans may have thought that this tragic story had come to an end and could be forgotten forever. The slave revolt was suppressed, Spartacus's name could be erased from people's memories, the gladiator arenas were once again filled with spectators thirsting for blood, and the Republic's warriors could return to their conquests, expanding the borders of the empire. But history is a stubborn thing, and it rarely obeys the will of those who try to rewrite it and remake it in their favor. And even after his death, Spartacus continued to fight, but now not on the battlefield, but in the memory of future generations, inspiring people to fight for freedom and justice. Rome stood in this war, but the fear of a new slave rebellion remained with it forever. Before the gladiator revolt, slaves were not taken seriously by anyone. They were taught to kill in the arena, but no one thought they were capable of organizing into a real army and posing a threat to the Roman Empire. Now it was obvious to everyone. The Roman authorities tightened control over gladiators and slaves, fearing new uprisings. Gladiator schools were transformed into well-fortified camps, security was doubled, and the recruitment of new fighters was carefully monitored to prevent unreliable elements from entering them. But the most important change was the policy towards slaves in general. Of course, the Roman Empire did not abolish slavery. This was simply impossible in a world built on the labor of enslaved people who made up a significant part of the empire's population. However, senators and large landowners drew certain conclusions from the Spartacus rebellion. Slaves now received more opportunities for emancipation. They began to be treated a little more carefully, and mass gatherings of slaves without supervision and control were prohibited in large cities. This was not a manifestation of mercy and philanthropy, but a rigid pragmatism dictated by fear and self-preservation. The Roman authorities finally realized that a slave who had no hope of improving his life and gaining freedom was a time bomb capable of exploding at any moment and inflicting a crushing blow to the existing order. And yet, despite the terrible fear of a repeat of the gladiator revolt and new slave uprisings, gladiator games did not disappear from the life of Roman society. After the Spartacus rebellion, one might have expected a tightening of existing bans, a reduction in the number of gladiator fights, and stricter measures towards slaves, but the exact opposite happened. The gladiator arenas became even more spectacular and bloodthirsty, attracting more and more spectators. The Romans craved blood, thrills, and a sense of danger, and now they looked at the gladiators in a completely different light, feeling a mixture of fear and admiration for them. Every fighter entering the arena could turn out to be a new Spartacus, ready to raise a rebellion and challenge the Roman Empire. Each gladiator performance served as a kind of reminder that Rome knew how to keep even the most ferocious and dangerous fighters under control, suppressing any attempts at disobedience. But in order to prevent a new rebellion, gladiators began to be separated, carefully ensuring that they did not form close-knit communities within gladiator schools and did not communicate with each other without supervision. Ludi became real military camps, guarded day and night, and their owners began to monitor order with redoubled attention, fearing the wrath of the Roman authorities. And yet, the arena continued to live and attract crowds of spectators. For hundreds of years after Spartacus's death, people came to the Colosseum and other amphitheaters to see warriors fight to the death, demonstrating their strength and courage. Even after the fall of the Roman Empire, this cruel tradition did not disappear without a trace, but was reflected in other forms. But if gladiator games were able to survive and outlive the Roman Empire, then the name of Spartacus, symbolizing rebellion and the struggle for freedom, should have disappeared forever from people's memory. The history of gladiators is a kind of paradox. The people whom the Roman Empire turned into instruments for entertaining the public ultimately became symbols of strength, courage, and defiance. The arena, where slaves were supposed to fight and die, gave rise to those who could challenge the system itself, shake the foundations of the Roman Empire, and make the Romans shudder with fear. Spartacus could not overthrow the Roman Empire, but he showed the world that even those who are considered slaves and not taken seriously can organize, rise up in revolt, and make themselves be reckoned with, changing the course of history. The story of gladiators isn't just a tale of brutal combat and bloodshed. It's a narrative woven with threads of freedom, courage, and the indomitable strength of the human spirit, a spirit capable of standing against even the mightiest empire. History is, at its heart, the story of individuals who once faced agonizing choices, surrender to injustice, or fight for their rights, even in the face of death. Perhaps that's why we still remember and honor those who chose the latter, who refused to break under the weight of circumstance, and who left an enduring mark on human history.